You know, the final judgment in the Bryan Kohberger murder case, it wasn't just about guilt or innocence in the end. It morphed into this huge legal fight over something, well, much darker, whether the public and, yeah, the absolutely massive, sort of insatiable true crime industry had a right to see the most graphic, most heartbreaking images of the victims.
That's exactly right. A judge was really pushed into an impossible corner for months. Had to choose between, government transparency, this idea of the public's right to know, and the desperate need to shield grieving families from more pain from this endless digitized trauma.
The cost of transparency felt like it was potentially the dignity of the people who died.
It really did.
Welcome to Nation Scope Podcast. Join us, Jordan and Jamie, as we dive into the latest headlines, the breaking stories, and the critical events shaping America and the world. From politics to culture, economy, technology, we try to analyze the news that really matters most.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into that extraordinary legal battle that came after the sentencing of Bryan Kohberger. This was for the 2022 University of Idaho murders. But this isn't, just about one awful case. It's a really high-stakes look at how our digital age is pushing the legal system, forcing courts to rethink, really redefine the limits of the public's right to know versus a victim's right to dignity.
We're going to unpack the city of Moscow's position. Remember their lawyers saying they wish they could just fire the records into the sun.
Yeah, powerful statement.
And why the judge finally ruled that, quote, blurring is not redacting. So stick with us. This case really sets a precedent for justice in this digital era.
Okay, so just to set the scene properly for you, let's quickly recap the basics. November 13th, 2022. 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, brutally murdered in Moscow, Idaho. The sheer violence of it drew this intense, sustained global media spotlight, something you don't often see outside, like major cities.
And then the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student studying criminology nearby, that just poured fuel on the fire. The global hunger for every single detail, for analysis of this specific, chilling crime. It was immediate, relentless, really.
Now, fast forward to the resolution, July 2025. And crucially, this didn't end with a public trial. Kohberger took a plea deal, pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder plus felony burglary. He got 4 consecutive life sentences, no parole, plus 10 years. Case closed, criminally speaking.
Right, but that plea agreement, while it brought finality, kind of created the next problem, this legal void. Because there was no public trial, no evidence presented and challenged in open court. The whole investigative file, including really sensitive graphic crime scene photos and videos, it was still sealed, but under public records laws, potentially accessible now.
Exactly. Once the case was fully adjudicated, fully closed, that file became the target. We're talking hundreds of public records requests from media outlets, sure, but also heavily from, the massive online true crime community, the one that drives millions of clicks.
And that hunger for the raw graphic detail, that's what kicked off this, well, explosive legal clash. It basically forced the court to pit transparency against human dignity, head to head.
And to understand that clash, you have to look at the specific laws in Idaho that were pulling in opposite directions. On one side, you've got the Idaho Public Records Act, and that law fundamentally leans towards disclosure.
Meaning that's the default, right? The starting point.
Yep.
It generally says seals on investigative records have to be lifted once a case is completely finished, which is why the city of Moscow felt legally required to start prepping those files for release. The law seemed clear.
But like you said, it's not the only law. Balancing that out is this really strong set of protections for victims. It's right there in the Idaho Constitution. Article 1, Section 22, and State Code 2, they guarantee victims the right to be treated with fairness, respect, dignity, and privacy.
So the judge is facing these 2 powerful competing legal mandates. How do they even approach that?
Well, the Public Records Act itself allows for a balancing test. It's not absolute. The court has to weigh the public's interest, which can be kind of abstracting. It's the very real, very concrete privacy interests of the victims and their families.
And the Kohberger case just pushed that test to the absolute limit, didn't it? Because of the sheer graphic nature of the evidence and this global demand.
Absolutely. This wasn't just a balancing test. It was maybe the most emotionally charged version of it Idaho courts had ever seen. The stakes felt incredibly high.
Okay, so let's get into the arguments that were made before Judge Megan Marshall. The families of Madison Mogen and Ethan Chapin, they were the ones petitioning, fighting to keep those records sealed. What was their main argument?
Their core argument was straightforward, but just deeply emotional. Releasing these images, showing their children's final moments in brutal detail, would inflict profound, lasting trauma.
Hmm.
And it was, they argued, a completely unwarranted invasion of privacy.
I remember reading Ethan Chapin's mother, Stacy Chapin's statement. It was heartbreaking. She said the images continue to reopen a wound that has yet to heal. You can only imagine the kind of secondary pain just knowing those images might get out there.
And their lawyer, Leander James, he was really sharp. He immediately attacked the city's proposed compromise, which was blurring the worst parts. James flat out said, "Blurring is not redacting."
That phrase just sticks with you. Blurring is not redacting. It's so much about trauma, right? Even if you pixelate it, you know it's behind the blur, the horror is still there, the context doesn't go away.
Precisely. And James didn't just talk about the immediate trauma. He brought up this idea of secondary victimization, specifically tied to the digital age. He argued these images wouldn't just be seen, they'd be instantly spread worldwide, and critically, commodified by a true crime sort of industry that uses this stuff for clicks and profit. Often misused, he said.
Wow. So framing it not just as privacy, but as defense against the kind of commercial exploitation of grief, that must have hit home with the judge.
I think it had to. It acknowledges the reality of today's media. These records wouldn't just be reviewed by, say, responsible journalists in a newsroom. They'd be instantly digitized, maybe manipulated, turned into memes, spread everywhere online for profit or just shock value.
Okay, so that's the family's powerful plea. What about the city of Moscow? They were holding the files. What was their position?
They described themselves as the man in the middle, just caught. Andrew Pluskal, the city's lawyer, was very upfront. He said, look, the Public Records Act basically compels us to release these. Now the case is over. But then came that quote about their reluctance.
The fire the records into the sun line?
Yes. If the law allowed, they would fire the records into the sun to prevent release.
It just spoke volumes about the pressure they were under politically, emotionally. They were essentially asking Judge Marshall, please give us the legal cover to protect these families, because they knew they'd likely get sued either way.
Yeah, sued by the media if they withheld, sued by the families if they released. An impossible spot for a local government. It really highlights the immense pressure when a global tragedy hits a smaller community. They need clear lines drawn.
And Judge Marshall ultimately drew that line for them. Her ruling was decisive, but also quite nuanced, wasn't it? She prioritized privacy.
She did. The core finding was that the extreme emotional distress, the release, would cause the family simply outweighs the public's interest in seeing those specific graphic depictions. She called the potential dissemination of such incredibly disturbing photos an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. Strong words.
But it wasn't a blanket ban on everything, right? She tried to find some middle ground.
Exactly. And this is the key legal detail. It wasn't total suppression. She ordered targeted redaction, meaning the city had to physically black out portions of the images that show any portion of the victims' bodies or the blood immediately surrounding them.
So preserve the record, but shield the visual trauma.
That's the balance she struck. And her reasoning hinged on the case status. She kept coming back to it. The fact remains, the murder investigation and the criminal case are closed. Since the public benefit of seeing raw, gruesome evidence diminishes hugely once the legal process is over because it's not needed for accountability anymore, that changes the whole balancing test. It tilts heavily towards privacy.
That's a really significant point. The timing matters. Post-adjudication calculus is different.
It shifts everything. Once accountability is done, the graphic stuff risks becoming just voyeurism, not necessary public information.
And she also tackled the whole fighting misinformation argument, didn't she? The idea that releasing everything combats online conspiracies.
She did. Media groups argue that releasing the raw data was the only way to counter the unfounded conspiracies you always see online after these cases.
Did she buy it?
Not really. She seemed quite skeptical. She concluded releasing the graphic images would likely have only a minor effect on stopping speculation. Conspiracy folks will believe what they want anyway. But releasing them would have a profound effect, a devastating effect, on the victims' families.
So prioritizing the definite human cost over a probably futile attempt to stop online rumors, that's a major statement.
It really is. And importantly, she didn't just shut down transparency entirely. She specifically affirmed the public's right to know by allowing other materials to be released. She mentioned, for instance, videos showing distraught friends of the victims on the morning their bodies were found.
So separating the trauma of the crime scene from the trauma around the discovery and the aftermath, A careful distinction.
Very careful. And if you zoom out from Idaho, this ruling actually fits into a broader national trend. What's interesting is that several states, you see this in Florida, Georgia, Texas, they've already passed laws specifically exempting graphic crime scene photos from public records requests.
So legislatures are recognizing these images are different, they need special handling, often limiting access just to family or requiring a court order.
Yeah, the law is trying to catch up to the speed of digital sharing. And there's even a federal parallel here. The Supreme Court case, National Archives versus Favish. That case dealt with death scene photos of a government official under FOIA, but the court unanimously said surviving family do have a significant personal privacy interest in those images.
Sounds like a direct precedent for Judge Marshall's thinking, right? Establishing a kind of postmortem dignity that survives the case itself.
It lays a strong foundation, and underpinning all this legal stuff is the sheer psychological impact of these images. The source materials noted research showing that even in a controlled courtroom, exposure to gruesome photos can prejudice a jury, make them react emotionally, not just factually.
Right. And if even the justice system, designed for facts, admits these images are inherently biasing and harmful, imagine unleashing them onto the wild west of the internet. The potential for widespread harm, for trauma, it's just exponentially greater.
It truly is. And when you look at it that way, Judge Marshall's ruling almost acts like a public health intervention. It's not just about protecting four specific families. It's arguably about mitigating a wider negative psychological event, protecting the broader public from consuming and spreading that kind of digitized horror. Vicarious trauma is real.
Yeah, the ruling really feels like a landmark, a necessary balancing act between transparency, which is vital, and basic human dignity in this totally new digital landscape. It forced the system to admit the media world has changed, and the old rules about disclosure could easily enable exploitation now, not just accountability.
And that leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? For all of us, really. Should
Mhm.
we just wait for laws like Idaho's ruling or specific statutes to protect this dignity? Or should the media itself, and maybe especially the true crime community online, take more responsibility? Voluntarily adopt stricter ethics, recognize the harm in turning tragedy into content, that tension between law, ethics, and our digital appetite for this stuff that's going to keep shaping our justice system for a long time to come.
You've been listening to NationScope podcast, where Jordan and Jamie analyze the stories shaping America and the world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.